In 1974, the last monarch of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie I, was deposed in a violent coup, and Ethiopia's 3,000-year-old monarchy, toppled by a communist military mob, came to an abrupt end. Important officials and members of the royal family were executed, imprisoned, and exiled. For 17 years following the coup, Ethiopia was ruled by a violent communist regime, the Derg, that attempted to change the long-standing values and structure of the country, resulting in the massacre of many. At that same time, rebels and ethno-nationalists who opposed the regime for power rose up, launching guerrilla warfare against the communist regime and amongst themselves. The most significant of these rebels, the TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front, declared in its manifesto that the Amhara, whom it viewed as its political enemies, were to be eradicated in order to create an ethno-state that it called Greater Tigray at the peril of Ethiopia. In 1991, when the communist Derg, upon the breakup of its most important ally, the communist USSR, was brought down, the TPLF, which had been at war with the Derg for its own power, changed its strategy and immediately replaced the Derg, entering the capital city, Addis Ababa. The TPLF, finding itself as the new government of Ethiopia, galvanized other anti-Ethiopian rebel groups that described themselves as liberation fronts, and throwing out Ethiopia's constitution, established an ethnic constitution that divided Ethiopia into 9 major autonomous ethnic unitarist states, declaring that Ethiopia was no more and that the existence of the new Ethiopia was contingent upon the coalition of the newly created, structurally seemingly independent and allegedly self-governing ethnic states. The system under this new constitution became to be known as Zenawism, ethnic federalism, but it was no true federalism at all. It was the formation of ethnic unitarist bastions that had no tolerance for diversity or the existence of ethnic others in their arbitrarily appointed ethnic territories. The Amhara people, who were viewed as the central entity for the perseverance of Ethiopia's former unity, were accused of being historically dominant and chased out of several of the newly created ethnic states. At the advent of the TPLF and its ethnic constitution, millions of Amharas began to experience genocidal attacks. Massacres took place sporadically, and countless Amharas were displaced in the millions from various regions. In the midst of this phenomenal eruption of crimes against humanity, the TPLF was attaining its long-dreamed goal. Ethiopia was breaking up from its core, and the genocidal attacks were not gaining any significant attention either by most Ethiopians who were victims of TPLF's chokehold and propaganda rhetoric, or by the international community that was not made aware of what had been taking hold. After nearly 3 decades of Ethiopia's slow disintegration, prolonged poverty, and ethnic politics, as well as the Amhara people's unceasing suffering, silent genocide, mass internal displacement, and their complete ostracization from any level of significant power among many other great crimes against humanity, the growing outrage birthed the people's resistance, and TPLF would be replaced by Abiy Ahmed, who himself had come from within it, but promising to change the course of history and swearing by the name of Ethiopia and its restoration. But unfortunately, after Abiy Ahmed's advent, The suffering of the Amhara worsened immediately. Atrocious massacres and genocidal attacks targeting the Amhara people intensified even more, and Amharas began to be killed and chased out of several regions, especially in Oromia, Welkite annexed into West Tigray, and Benshangul, where innocent Amhara women, children, and poor farmers were slaughtered en masse in broad daylight with machetes in the cruelest of manners. It was as though there was no government and nobody to protect them. Piled up bodies would be buried in mass graves using bulldozers, with photographs of the dreadful event eerily reminiscent of Nazi Germany's Jewish Holocaust surfacing on social media. To better understand the parallel, it is worth noting that the Amhara people of Ethiopia are a Semitic-speaking people of Afro-Asiatic ancestry who have a history of biblical origin and a language, Amharic, that's in the same lingual family group as Hebrew and Arabic. And some anti-Amhara ethnic political factions characterize the Amhara as outsiders, despite that Amharas have lived in and built Ethiopia for thousands of years. Entire Amhara towns like Ataye, near the capital city, would be invaded by heavily armed ethnic terrorists, committing massacres and burning the towns in attempts to ethnically cleanse the areas. In the region named Benshangul, where Amharas had formerly lived for centuries, Amhara civilians are hunted like wild animals with bows and arrows by ethnic terrorist groups of the region. In Oromia, their bodies are cut into pieces with machetes. In all this, the Abiy Ahmed regime's action, or rather inaction, was a far cry from protecting innocent Amhara civilians or bringing the attacking ethnic terrorist factions and their foot soldiers to justice. On the contrary, military troops and police who were meant to protect the people were removed from areas where the massacres would take place. The outrage and cry for help of the people were falling on deaf ears, and the international community, although beginning to hear of the atrocities, is misled by the loud blame-shifting rhetoric of the attackers' PR, who are given platforms on global media outlets, as no voices from the Amhara are given platforms to speak out. Following TPLF's massacre of the members of the Northern Command Defense Forces in an attempt to secure power, war broke out between the central government and TPLF. TPLF quickly shaped the image of the war as a war on Tigray and created a portrayal where the Amhara are drawn as being the main perpetrators in a war that is depicted as being a genocide against Tigrayans carried out by Amharas and Eritreans. Immediately, TPLF and its forces known as Samra committed a great massacre at Maikadra, where over 1,000 Amhara civilians were slaughtered and buried in a mass grave. Similar massacres targeting Amharas near the disputed Amhara and Tigrayan borders would take place, such as the Jena massacre of Amharas. But international allies of the TPLF, as well as CNN, which has practically become a factory of deceit, and other similar media, journals, and politicians would demonize the Amhara for the suffering of Tigrayans, completely disregarding the plight and suffering of the Amhara undergoing genocide and famine. International aid that goes to Tigrayans would be, as feared, diverted to support the TPLF, and TPLF's resuscitated forces would eventually invade the Amhara region, causing millions of Amhara civilians to have no access to food and basic necessities. Now, Millions in the Amhara region in northern Wello, in areas such as Wag Khimra and Lasta and northern Gondar are suffering from famine as a direct result of these war crimes, but their cries are falling on deaf ears because of the regime's neglect and the disturbing bias and partisanship of actors in the international community. Hence, we call upon all people who care for humanity and justice to stand for the suffering Amhara people. Thank you.